Bobby Marks, ESPN front office insider, here to talk a little bit more about the move that really, Bobby, it seemed like it hushed down a little bit. Like Kyrie was going to make it to at least training camp, but all of a sudden, how bizarre is it that the top two teams in the East got on the phone and worked something out of this magnitude?
Well, no, it is bizarre. I mean, I think especially when you look at where Cleveland was, we probably didn't think there was a chance that, maybe they can win the trade on paper. And I think if you asked maybe 100 people, it would probably be 50-50 split down the middle as far as, at least right now, maybe who got the better of the trade. Long term, it certainly could be Boston based on what happens with LeBron in Cleveland. But, yeah, I mean, rarely do you trade within conference, especially two teams that have just met in the Eastern Conference finals, a few months ago.
So, Bobby, if you look at the trade on the surface for 2017-2018, the top two teams in the East swap guards. Cleveland gets a few extra pieces. Crowder, pretty nice piece that's kind of getting undervalued, I think. Did they make a dent or make a significant swap in this season?
Well, I like it for Cleveland based on, I am a big fan of Isaiah Thomas. Of course, he's got to be healthy here. Crowder, I think, gives him a different dimension just because he could play the 3 or 4 for you. Certainly makes him on Shumpert maybe a little bit more expendable here. That Brooklyn pick, I mean, that's a wait and see until 2018. So I think on paper, at least, it kind of gives, Cleveland some much needed depth that they can, now I think they're about 9 to 10 deep here. So I still give them the edge over Boston as far as where the Celtics lineup is. I thought, they did lose, two pieces with Thomas and Crowder, although, Irving is certainly probably a little bit more of an upgrade than where Isaiah is.
Now, if you're in the front office and you've done this before, I mean, I'm sure you guys sat around. Do you think the conversation in Boston is, hey, we don't intend on signing Isaiah? Is that why this deal's made?
Well, I think there has to be a concern as far as what his price tag would have been. He is he'll have 7 years of service next year. He can pay. He can earn up to $30 million. I don't see him getting that money on the market there. So I think there's a concern for their player who similar to Toronto and Kyle Lowry. With Isaiah, he turns, I believe, 29 in February, and are willing to commit $25-30 million for a player who will be in his 30s during that contract. So I think that would be certainly a concern there. I mean, you saw with the Avery Bradley trade. I know that was to clear some room for Gordon Hayward, but there was concerns as far as how much did you want to pay Avery there? Were you willing to pay him $20 million? And now you get rid of your starting backcourt from a year ago. You swap it with Kyrie Irving. We'll see what happens at the 2 guard. Might be by committee, maybe Marcus Smart or Jaylen Brown there, and certainly a cheaper alternative.
Bobby Marks, ESPN front office insider, with us here breaking down this trade. So, does this trade do enough to entice LeBron? And that pick certainly has to be attractive. Even if LeBron walks out the door, Cleveland potentially has a franchise player walking right in to replace him.
Well, you're right. And I think what it does is that it could refresh him a little bit here where, the concern for him was that are we doing enough to keep up with Golden State? And now you move some pieces around, you bring in 2 players, you kind of change up your team a little bit, and now you go into this upcoming season with a little bit of a different look. I mean, I think the best of both worlds would be is that you get back to an NBA Finals. Who knows what will happen? Probably likely lose if it's Golden State, and you get a top 3 pick here in that Nets pick, and probably potentially could be another good draft. So, that might be enough to sway him to stay in Cleveland, to stay in the East instead of maybe going out west there. So I think the worst case scenario would have been, with LeBron leaving, Kyrie being disgruntled. Now you're really stuck in kind of no man's land. At least that pick next year gives you that insurance that if they both leave and you don't bring back Isaiah, that you can kind of wipe the slate clean here.
Right.
And kind of rebuild through the draft a little bit.
Yeah, and it also gives Cleveland the opportunity now to get their hands on a younger player, which is something that they've been lacking. That it was like you look around and say, how are they ever going to get this team a little younger and start moving, the post-LeBron years? they have a chance to keep LeBron potentially and get younger, and that's something that they weren't staring at before. So they have a lot more flexibility all of a sudden.
Well, no, you're right. I mean, they were the oldest team, and probably still the oldest team going into this season here. Their draft picks in the previously have been traded. The Kyle Korver trade, there was, the pick this previous year. So they're, besides Kyrie and I guess Tristan Thompson, not a team that's been built through the draft here. So now you add the Brooklyn pick. You still have your own pick in 2018, and you can maybe move that pick, maybe with a player and maybe upgrade it if you can, because now you have that Nets pick and you can hold on to it. So I think they're in a better spot, at least long term, than they were a few days ago with what was going on with Kyrie Irving.
What about Cleveland this year? Did they close any gap? They didn't make this deal thinking they closed the gap on the Warriors at all, did they?
No, I mean, it's amazing that Golden State, a team that went through the regular season, basically, but there was one game during the playoffs last year, could get better in the off season, and they did get better with Nick Young and Caspi, and you basically brought back your whole team. Now you've got year 2 of Durant. There probably won't be any hiccups getting through training camp, and that team can really hit the ground running. And of course, injuries will always creep in down the road here, but even what Houston did and OKC, I don't see any of those teams. Maybe be a little more competitive, possibly, but I don't see any of those teams putting a dent in where Golden State is.
So why Cleveland last night? Obviously, this is something that they've been thinking about. They were in a pretty bad position. How do you think that they ended up knowing the position they were in, where this guy comes out and says, I want to be traded, yet they held the card. They didn't have to trade this guy. How do you think Cleveland made out with what they were up against?
Well, I mean, it's almost similar like Indiana with Paul George, although Kyrie had another year left on his contract, so you had a little bit more leverage there as far as from a value standpoint. I just thought as the weeks went on and we got into training camp, the value certainly goes down there. And whenever you're trading an all-star or superstar player, you never, at least on paper, you never really win the trade here. And I think for where they were, I understand that you traded him you kept them in the East. You didn't go out West. I think a lot of it had to do as far as a long-term commitment Irving was willing to make, maybe in Denver or Phoenix, some of those other places there. So, I mean, I think it accomplished their goals. With Thomas, a point guard that you can have a top 15 point guard. Crowder's under a great contract. He's a wing, and you get that draft asset that as we talked about, yet you were lacking.
Yeah, you can make the case, I guess, that Thomas and Kyrie are somewhat of a wash. I mean, Kyrie's a bigger guy, probably a stronger, more durable player, but they both can score, both lousy defensively. But you get Crowder there, you can make the argument that Cleveland maybe nudged themselves to be a little bit better than they were a year ago, and Boston is in a similar spot.
You're right, and I think even with Isaiah going into free agency, I don't see him getting a max contract. I don't, even if it's if LeBron stays and it's and he's willing to re-sign in Cleveland. I just think although he's an all-star type player, I just think the last 2 summers will really put a dent into the summer of 2008 from a free agency standpoint. And similar to like these point guards on the market this past summer, if he's willing to go to a place that's rebuilding and make more money, then sure, he can do so. But I think where Thomas comes in might be a little bit where Kyrie left off as far as that $20-21 million number possibly. So albeit a little bit older, but I think from where Cleveland was, as I said, I mean this is as best as of a deal that they're going to get.
Now, if you were on the Boston side, Bobby Marks with us from ESPN Front Office Insider, formerly worked in the Nets front office. If you're sitting with Danny Ainge, do you feel comfortable saying, Danny, yes, make this deal? I like what you gave up.
I do, because you still have that Laker pick next year. You'll get it if it's 2 to 5. You still have some assets. You've got a Memphis and a Clipper pick in 2019, and you didn't have to get rid of Jason Tatum, who was kind of the guy that Cleveland was targeting here. So you were able to retain. You still have a bunch of assets to maybe even make that improve this team. And this team is not going to go anywhere for a while. I mean, you've got If Kyrie commits long-term in 2019, Hayward just signed for a 4-year deal. Horford's got, 3 years left. We'll figure out what happens with Marcus Smart. He's rookie extension eligible up until October 16th. So it's not like all these guys are on 1-year contracts, and they're all in the prime of their career.
The trade kicker was waived by Kyrie. Does that an indication of how bad he wanted to get out of there?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, it was $5.8 million that he waived. He would have got it. I think a lot of it had to do with making the deal work itself, just based on Isaiah's number, was so low, and Crowder to get the deal to work. If he hadn't waived it, Boston would have had to probably got their roster a little bit more. So I think you saw that with Chris Paul in Houston. Paul also waived his most of his trade kicker back in late June to make the deal work. So I think to get out of Cleveland and to make a deal work for both sides, I think it was probably the best thing to do.
Bobby, in your opinion, or maybe you have some insight, knowledge of this, what happened here? How did this break down to the point where it got this bad that they had to get rid of a player of this magnitude? I mean, sure, they got a great return, which we got to commend them for, but I'm sure they would have been fine status quo, staying with what they had.
Well, no, you're right, and I think for Kyrie, it was more of a proactive measure based on what the uncertainty of where LeBron is what's going to happen with him in 2018. I think if LeBron James, going into this offseason would have come out and said, I'm committed to Cleveland long term and I'm willing to sign a new contract in the summer of 2018, I don't know if we would be having this discussion right now. And I think the uncertainty of LeBron, him going to another team, and I think Kyrie looked at it like, well, if he does, now I'm stuck with, Tristan Thompson and Shumpert and J.R. Smith, Kevin Love, guys that probably don't fit my style. So, although rare to kind of 2 years away from being a free agent, you kind of go this route. At least he did it, I guess. I don't know if I want to say the right way, but at least Cleveland was able to get something back of value instead of him leaving, unannounced in 2019 as a free agent.
And I guess if you're Kyrie, there could have been 25 worse scenarios that he could have ended up with than landing in Boston. This is a great ending for him, too.
Oh, it's a great ending. I mean, you could have went out west. I mean, to a Phoenix team, would have still been in the lottery, but you would have been the man, and you would have had, you and Devin Booker would probably be in the backcourt of the future, or even, a team like Denver. But you do stay in the East, a little bit less competition there, and from a best case scenario, I mean, that's I don't think you could have probably drawn it up any better.
Yeah, and I guess huge trade, blockbuster names. 2 top teams in the conference, but not much has really changed. The East is still a 2-team race, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is some now. I think there's certainly separation with Boston and Cleveland for where maybe Washington or Toronto and Milwaukee teams probably in that. I guess that 4, 5, 6. Toronto also in that range there. But I think both those teams have certainly are the clear cut in the Eastern Conference.
Don't forget Philly.
I know. Hey, it's going to be. I think it's for Philadelphia, and I think that's kind of what Brian Colangelo has been smart about, that this patient approach with these short-term contracts that we've talked about before with Redick and Amir, and kind of laying the weeds, and we'll see what happens with Embiid in the next month or two, but they'll be positioned in the future if James goes elsewhere, and you'll have the flexibility to add some players next offseason.
Bobby Marks, at Bobby Marks42, the front office insider, ESPN.com, and read his take on the trade over at ESPN.com in the insider section. Bobby, great to catch up with you, pal.
Thanks. Appreciate it.